8 p.m. American Public Media.
Amelia Island celebrates the 81st annual Tax Slayer Gator Bowl, held in Jacksonville Saturday evening, December 27th, offering holiday accommodations near the beaches and downtown of Amelia Island. Info at ameliaisland.com/taxslayer. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, from the resuscitated proposal to drill off Florida's coast to the dismissed criminal indictments against the president's enemies, we discuss the latest political news with Chris Hand. Then, what a trio of stranded astronauts tells us about the burgeoning problem of space junk. We ask our resident spaceman to help us explore the known and unknown hazards. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or head over to firstcoastconnect.org where you can get all of the ways you can connect with us and sign up for our daily newsletter. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. The Trump administration says it will appeal after a federal judge dismissed criminal charges against former FBI Director Jim Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James. The judge found the prosecutor, Lindsay Halligan, appointed at President Trump's urging, was illegally named. Constitutional scholar Kim Whaley says the decision leaves major questions about what prosecutors can do next.
There's another law that says you can extend for 6 months. There's a grace period if an indictment is dismissed. I think under this ruling, the argument would be there's no six-month grace period because there was no actual indictment. There was no valid indictment. For Letitia James, she's within, these alleged crimes are within the statute of limitations. So I expect they'll just go back with a new grand jury and she'll be facing a similar process.
Speaking in Memphis yesterday, Attorney General Pam Bondi defended Halligan's appointment. A new study from the Pew Research Center shows a growing number of Latinos are concerned about the nation's economy and immigration. NPR's Domenico Montanaro reports they blame President Trump's policies.
The Pew Research Center polled more than 5,000 Latinos in the past 2 months, which is more than 10 times the average of a national poll. And what they found was significant. 70% disapprove of the job that Trump is doing. On the economy, 4 in 5 view it negatively, and 61% say Trump's policies have made things worse. On immigration, 2/3 disapprove of how Trump's handling it. More than that say that he's doing too much when it comes to deportations. Overall, a majority say they have serious concerns about their place in America, and 1 in 3 say they've contemplated leaving the country. Domenico Montanaro, NPR News, Washington.
In Brazil, former President Jair Bolsonaro remains under preemptive arrest and could begin serving his 27-year prison sentence at any time. His lawyers declined to file any further appeals by yesterday's deadline. Julia Carneiro reports the case against him can now be closed.
A Supreme Court panel with 4 justices voted unanimously to maintain Bolsonaro's preemptive arrest. The far-right leader was detained over the weekend, hours after a vigil was called outside his home, and he used a soldering iron to try to open his ankle monitor. The court argued that tampering with the device indicated flight risk and a blatant violation of precautionary measures set by the judiciary. Under custody, the former president told the judge he was having hallucinations after a change in medication and thought there was a wiretap in the ankle monitor. Bolsonaro has been sentenced to over 27 years in prison for attempting a coup after losing his 2022 re-election bid. For NPR News, I'm Julia Carneiro in Rio.
A government report shows retail sales were up 0.2% in September. The report was delayed due to the government shutdown. This is NPR News.
Good morning. You're listening to WJCT News, 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Stephen Ponson. It is now 9:04. Families along the First Coast are getting help putting food on the table ahead of Thanksgiving. At the Mandarin Food Bank's giveaway yesterday, 450 packages of frozen turkey and all the fixins were donated. Among those who received food was Mark Novak. He visited the food bank for the first time due to his cancer that's in remission and being unable to work.
Oh, it's just awesome. I mean, it means the world just to get some, so I wasn't sure how I was going to feed them. Well, we got here an hour and a half before, and so we were pretty close, but even an hour and a half, it was still quite a line, but it's still well worth it.
The food bank on Old St. Augustine Road helps Mandarin residents with monthly food and financial help, and its director says more people than usual have sought assistance in recent months. Meanwhile, the Jacksonville Jaguars teamed up with Feeding Northeast Florida to give out about 600 free holiday meals to those in need yesterday afternoon. It was the 7th year the Jags and the Regional Food Bank teamed up to provide holiday meals. Public health authorities in Georgia are warning Jekyll Island residents and visitors of a rabid bobcat. The bobcat, which attacked a person on Sunday, tested positive for rabies. Raccoons, foxes, and bats can also spread the deadly virus, as can infected dogs and cats. Folks are urged to steer clear of animals they don't know and to make sure their pets are vaccinated. Contact authorities if you see an animal behaving oddly. Symptoms of rabies include biting, aggression, and foaming at the mouth. We'll have low rain chances, breezy conditions, and it'll be warm this afternoon in Northeast Florida.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Fidelity Investments. A dedicated wealth advisor can help build a comprehensive wealth plan. Learn more at fidelity.com/wealth. Investment minimums apply. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, could Alligator Alcatraz eat up some of the state's projected budget surplus? We talk about that and all the political headlines with attorney and government expert Chris Hand. Later in the program, what does it mean to throw something away in the cosmos? We discuss the real crisis of space waste. But first, we are joined, as we are each month, by attorney and government expert Chris Hand. There have been a flood of headlines in recent hours and days, and Chris is here to help us drink from the fire hose. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, and I have to say, Throw Something Away from the Cosmos sounds like a great album name. So for any musicians out there.
Yeah, write that down.
Yeah,
That's a good
right.
one. So I mentioned, I mean, as journalists, as commentators, a lot to take in just in the last couple of days, and it is hard to keep pace. So we've got a lot of state issues that I want to get to, but let's start, if we can, with this Trump indictments yesterday, because I know that a lot of people want to hear from you on that. A couple of, major Trump-endorsed indictments dismissed. Catch us up on sort of the legal side of why that decision was made.
Sure. Well, just to first give a little bit of background about the two individuals involved. The big news yesterday was a U.S. federal district court judge dismissed indictments against former FBI Director James Comey, New York Attorney General Tish James. Just to give a little bit of background, Jim Comey obviously had been the FBI director for the latter part of President Obama's second term. The beginning of President Trump's first term became famous or infamous, depending on one's perspective, during the 2016 election when he investigated then Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton's email server, was then fired by President Trump as FBI director during the president's first term in office. The other person, Tish James, the Attorney General of New York, both seen as political opponents of the president. One, Comey, because they had a difficult relationship, and Comey has spoken out against him, President Trump, since the firing. Letitia James, who actually filed a lawsuit against Donald Trump, previously for kind of civil matters related to his business. So both perceived as political opponents. Both where efforts were made once President Trump came back into office. He was very public and visible about wanting to see them indicted.
Mm.
Career prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia said that essentially they didn't find there was enough evidence to bring indictments in Jim Comey's case. That was for alleged perjury in testimony to Congress in September of 2020. In the case of Letitia James, it was alleged mortgage fraud. So career prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia declined to bring a prosecution for lack of evidence. The career prosecutor who was serving as U.S. attorney also declined to bring it. So he was removed from office and replaced with a new U.S. attorney in the Eastern District on an interim basis. That new U.S. attorney was able to secure indictments against former FBI Director Comey and Attorney General James. But yesterday, those were dismissed, and they were dismissed on the grounds that under the law, Anne, a president can appoint an interim U.S. attorney for a certain period of time, 120 days under the law, but then cannot just continually repeat, appointing successive interim U.S. attorneys. That way, otherwise, you'd kind of get around the requirement that the Senate has to confirm a nominee for U.S. attorney. So the court ruled that the second U.S. attorney, who had been appointed by the Justice Department, her appointment was invalid. Therefore, the indictments were invalid and dismissed them without prejudice. What that means is it is conceivable the Justice Department could bring those charges again, but for now they have been dismissed.
And that attorney that you're referencing is Lindsay Halligan. And this, she has also been the subject of very serious questions from a federal judge involved, wondering whether she has not just, whether the appointment was correct, but whether her actions have been legally sound in terms of how she brought the indictment, whether the grand jurors actually saw the full indictment that she, has attributed to them, that basically some of the elements of that indictment changed in a significant way. The New York Times described this hearing before the federal district court judge in Alexandria, Virginia, as excruciatingly awkward. Basically, this judge calling Halligan on the carpet, essentially, about how she conducted herself and whether it was legally sound.
Well, there are a lot of questions about, there are very strict protocols involved and during criminal indictments, particularly at the federal level, because obviously there are questions of guilt and innocence here. And it's, in the interests of the U.S. government to follow those protocols because they want to make sure that if an indictment actually comes to a trial situation, there aren't procedural flaws that might prevent the government from moving forward. A lot of questions about that, whether the grand jury that was convened ultimately approved the indictment that was ultimately brought, whether a sufficient number of people signed off on the indictment. Typically, in these cases, you have multiple prosecutors involved in this process. In this case, she was the only one who was involved in this case. So there are a lot of questions about that. But obviously now the indictment has been dismissed, and we'll have to see. The Trump administration has said they plan to appeal, but we'll have to see whether that appeal is successful, number one, or if they attempt to bring the indictments again, they can do that, particularly in the case of former FBI Director Comey. That indictment was brought in September of 2025. There is a 5-year statute of limitations under federal law for charges of perjury, meaning that after those 5 years has elapsed, one can no longer bring those charges. I am sure the Comey legal team will now argue that since that indictment has been dismissed and the 5 years has lapsed, the federal government no longer has the right to bring charges against him. Point is, we're going to continue to see a lot of litigation about these indictments going forward. But for now, the charges have been dismissed against former FBI Director Jim Comey and New York Attorney General Tish James.
And just one of those concerns was the timetable that Lindsay Halligan had before she introduced these indictments. I mean, she basically was appointed. She was the former personal attorney for the president, had no prosecutorial experience when she took this seat, and according to reports, actually had difficulty finding her way through the courthouse to where she was supposed to be or where she was supposed to stand in court. So very green. But she brought this indictment after just a few days in that role. Is it even possible for somebody to bring a criminal indictment of this complexity in that short amount of time? Or is it credible that having inherited some of the legwork that was done by the previous prosecutor who was fired for not bringing charges, that she was able to just kind of pick up the ball and make that happen?
Well, I think it's highly unusual in a situation like this where career prosecutors in the office who have kind of looked at the case recommend against an indictment due, in their opinion, to lack of evidence that the U.S. attorney, in this case, the interim one you're describing, actually goes ahead and brings charges anyway in that situation. Of course, also very unusual for the U.S. Justice Department to be getting involved in the way that it is with indictments being carried out by an individual U.S. attorney's office as well. So there's a lot that's unorthodox and unusual about this process. Again, part of why we've seen both the Comey and the James legal teams, even though these are separate indictments, they sort of join forces for purposes of this particular litigation because some of the issues are the same. I think it's why we've seen a number of these issues sort of outlined in the motions they've made and the arguments they've brought, because everything we're seeing is very unorthodox and a departure for how this has typically been handled in the past.
And assuming, I mean, that the indictment is refiled against Tish James, and again, we don't know what might happen in the James Comey case. Do you see? I mean, it sounds like the standard for proving a vindictive prosecution is pretty high, and that absent some of the concerns that have been raised about this particular prosecutor and the way that she obtained these indictments, if those are taken off the table, it might be harder to make the case of a vindictive prosecution, just according to the law and what it allows.
Well, I think there's going to be an even higher bar going forward to try and bring these indictments again, not only because of the statute of limitations I issued in the Comey case, but also because I think the federal judge in this particular situation, and probably throughout the Eastern District, have now made it very clear that there's going to be very strict scrutiny on any indictments that are brought to make sure that they have satisfied kind of the protocols that go along with that, the procedural norms that go along with that, and that they are done in accordance with the law. So I think notice has been served at this point that, again, the federal judges in the Eastern District, the one in particular who handed down yesterday's ruling, is really going to subject any indictment to the strictest of scrutiny to make sure that it is done in accordance with the law. A lot of questions about whether these were.
Yeah. Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking to Chris Hand about the latest headlines. You can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org and find all the ways that you can connect with us. You can also sign up for our new newsletter there. Chris, I want to move on now to some, I guess, the governor's status right now. So we know that he has about a year left to go, officially lame duck as he heads into this legislative session, but he has no shortage of really big ticket items, I guess you could call them, major priorities that he is asking of this legislature. Each of them a real heavy lift. What is he asking the legislature to consider and to approve?
Well, Ron DeSantis is facing what every two-term governor in Florida has faced since we started allowing governors to run for two terms several decades ago, and that's a shot clock that is rapidly depleting. This is his last legislative session, his last opportunity to move legislative priorities through the Florida House and Florida Senate. And as you say, there's no shortage of big ideas that he wants to pursue in the 2026 session, which starts on January the 13th, so less than 2 months from now. One being he wants to do a mid-cycle congressional redistricting of the type that we've seen in other states around the country, Texas, California, places like that. That's high on his agenda. He wants to abolish property taxes for homestead property in Florida, which would obviously be a big change. I know we'll talk more about that. He wants to end vaccine mandates in the state of Florida, and he wants to regulate artificial intelligence, or AI. So huge priorities. In some of the kind of pre-session analysis, one of the people they've quoted is Senator Don Gates from the Panhandle, who's a kind of a longtime stalwart of the Florida legislature, who essentially said
father of Matt Gates,
but in his own right has been a longtime state senator. Now had served previously for 8 years now in his sort of second kind of 8-year turn at the Capitol. And essentially he said, those are very ambitious priorities, and the governor might be fortunate to accomplish one of those in those sessions, which is not unusual for a last-year governor, right? You have a lot of political capital at the beginning of your time in office. It rapidly depletes and depreciates, and there's a lot less in this final year. The governor while still having a fairly cordial relationship with the Florida Senate, has a very contentious relationship now with the Florida House. The Florida House Speaker, Danny Perez, and the governor, I think it's very safe to say they are not friends. And so all of that makes it much more difficult for the governor to move any piece of legislation, particularly the four major items that this governor wants to see occur in the legislature. So, again, we'll have to watch very closely between mid-January and mid-March to see what accomplishes. But that very aggressive last year agenda somewhat flies in the face of what history says a final year governor can accomplish in the legislature. But that's why they meet for the 60-day session, so we can find out whether that is true this year or not as well.
So we're going to get into some of those specific requests that the governor is making of lawmakers in a bit, but I do want to talk about kind of how politics might be impacting this session, in part because we had yet another candidate enter the governor's race. This is a unknown, sort of political unknown named James Fishback. He's been sort of marginally involved in DOJ efforts at the national level, and he has never held public office. He's actually, according to voter records, never voted in a primary, which is what he'll be asking voters to do if they support him. But I think most of note is the comments, the way he entered the race this week, including his attacks on his primary opponent, his ostensible primary opponent, Byron Donalds, who's been endorsed by Donald Trump, calling him a slave. Let's take a listen to what he had to say, and let's talk a little bit about its impact.
Byron Donalds is a slave. I'm sorry, he's a slave. He is a slave to his donors. He is a slave to the corporate interests, to the tech bros that want to turn our state into, his own words, a financial capital.
So we should say, for people who don't know, Byron Donalds is a black man. Obviously, incredibly incendiary language to call someone something like that. And, he has been in other ways, around the edges, making similar comments, calling him a DEI Republican, and then trying to walk that back, saying he meant DEI didn't earn it. That's what he was saying the acronym meant. But regardless, he has been very anti-immigrant. He's been pushing back on H-1B visas. Where does all of this kind of race-based politics enter into this? How does that complicate things for the other candidates? How does it complicate things for anyone in Florida politics?
And I've been involved in some form or fashion in Florida politics for almost 35 years. I don't think I've ever seen a candidate for governor or any statewide office launch their campaign with such a naked racial attack as we saw that come from Mr. Fishback in Tallahassee yesterday. It was in an era where very little shocks us anymore. His calling his opponent, his primary opponent, who happens to be black, a slave, is one of the more shocking things I've seen in recent politics. As you say, it's very much in keeping with other aspects of Mr. Fishback's campaign. He is a CEO of an investment management firm running a very sort of nativist campaign. As you say, there's some language he's used saying like, it's our country and we're not going to let them steal it from us. So there's a lot of language that we might have heard, sort of during the George Wallace kind of era in politics that's sort of now being brought back in this campaign. It's hard to see a lane for Mr. Fishback actually being successful in this primary for a variety of reasons. Now there are multiple candidates in the race. As we said, Congressman Byron Donalds, who's been the subject of this attack, is a congressman from Southwest Florida who's running. Former House Speaker Paul Renner, who was recently on this show to talk about his candidacy from Flagler County, is running, and now Mr. Fishback. The dynamics of this race strongly favor Congressman Donald. It's a Republican primary. He's been endorsed by President Trump, who's obviously still remains very popular among Republicans, especially in Florida. In a multi-candidate field, that endorsement is particularly powerful because no one has to win an outright majority to win the primary, just a plurality. Congressman Donalds has raised, tens of millions of dollars toward his campaign at this point. So it's very hard at this moment to see what the lane for Mr. Fishback is. He claims to be running as the sort of ideological heir to Governor Ron DeSantis, has not been endorsed by the governor. In fact, the governor's lieutenant governor, Jay Collins, is also entertaining a bid for governor, and there's increasing speculation that he will get in the race himself sometime later this year or early 2026. So it's not clear what the exact lane is here, but if this is the language that Mr. Fishback continues using in this campaign, I think it tells us something about the tenor of this Republican primary over the course of the next 10 months.
We should say we are in communication with Byron Donalds, folks, and we hope to have him on the program soon as well. So, in terms of budget prospects, I mean, as this legislative session gets rolling, the chief consideration always is the money. And so, this has been projected to be a year with a good budget surplus, but it's not clear that that is going to withstand the demands that are being made on this budget. Um, Knowing that some, pandemic funding has ended, knowing that certain costs that maybe weren't entirely anticipated, like Alligator Alcatraz, have added to the state's cost burden. What is the financial outlook for the state for this year and then for the next couple?
According to state economists, and each fall, and state economists are charged with coming up with budget projections for future years, reporting those to what's called the Legislative Budget Commission, which is comprised of members of the House and Senate who can sort of make some adjustments based on those projections. This year, the state of Florida is projected to be in relatively good shape, a $4 billion surplus in the budget. But state economists have warned that is going to turn in the next next two fiscal years. For the 2026-2027 budget year, the state is projected to run a deficit of $1.5 billion. And then for the 2027-2028 fiscal year, so 2 years from now, is projected to run a deficit of almost $7 billion. That is undoubtedly going to affect the course of this year's session. They had previously projected a potential deficit this year, and they kind of pulled back on spending some in last year's session, and that's why we see the surplus we do this year. But I think those future budget projections are going to have a big impact on spending decisions the legislature makes in 2026 in efforts to try and forestall or mitigate those future year deficits.
How does Florida compare to, is this a unique situation that our state is experiencing? Are there similar strains being seen, in other state capitals?
It's a nationwide issue. I do kind of work around the country on kind of government issues, and you see it in state capitals all across the country. They're increasingly fiscally constrained for a number of reasons. One, economic factors have kind of shrunk revenue. There's obviously less money coming from the federal government than there was in the past. That's another factor that's out there. So this is not uniquely a Florida issue. This is an issue affecting states all across the country, and one kind of based on these projections that could become more difficult over the next couple of years. Again, not just in Florida, but in other state capitals as well.
So when a government is facing a tighter budget or concerns about a straight up deficit, what are the things that we know to look for or to prepare for? Are there some targets that are typically, at particular risk? What are the kinds of programs that lawmakers turn to first with a budget act?
And when they used to ask Willie Sutton why he robbed banks, his answer was because that's where the money is. Well, I mean, I think if one wants to kind of look at how a state government, what cuts it might make, you have to look at where the money is in a particular budget. In the state of Florida, huge chunks of the budget are dedicated to programs or initiatives in the areas of education and healthcare. Those are areas where I think we sort of will have to look to see if the state makes changes in those particular areas going forward. I don't think we'll see radical steps taken this year, but you may begin to see some slowdown in spending. The governor may wield a very heavy veto pen again, like he has done in recent years to try and cut spending. In the last couple of sessions, there's been a little bit of a anything you can do, I can do better sort of vibe when it comes to the state budget, as the legislature has, tried to cut the budget from what the governor proposed. And then he's tried to, issue vetoes to kind of cut it even beyond what they did.
Or immigration.
Yeah, right. I would not be at all surprised to see kind of a similar, the governor's going to propose a budget at the outset of the session on January 13th. I would not be at all surprised to see the legislature come back with a budget that spends even less. and then the governor, wield a very heavy veto pen, after the session's over.
We mentioned, the pandemic funding, the end of that, and that is going to be impacting state governments and city governments around the country. But in Florida, there's this sort of balance. There has been this effort and this pride in luring more people to the state. A lot of those people have been older people, a lot of boomers moving to the state. And so you have this population that's booming. And so presumably with that comes, some dollars, property taxes that may be additional revenues. But they're also a senior population, and that can be costly as well. And so this is a state that is proud of growing, and this governor has also made that a real, he's planted the flag on bringing people from other states. But does that matter that some of them are going to be perhaps more dependent on the system when it comes to things like healthcare? Certainly, probably less for education, but more as a cost deficit for the state.
I think an even bigger factor, Ann, is that what we don't have any longer in Florida is just people moving in and nobody moving out, right? That it's just sort of unchecked growth. I think particularly because of a variety of issues, whether that's sort of weather and sort of hurricanes, whether that's cost pressures. Florida did not used to be as costly as it is on items like like homeowners insurance, just general cost of living, cost of housing. That has driven a number of people out of the state as well. So again, if you used to look at the sort of credits and debits of Florida's population growth, everything was in the credits column as people just sort of moved in. And obviously, as you say, a number of people are still moving in. But I think one thing that's different about the modern era is you also have a number of people who are relocating because of a variety of factors, including some of the ones I've mentioned. So it's no longer a situation where growth can truly sort of pay for itself. There's so many different sort of fiscal pressures that the state has to look at a variety of kind of efforts to try and make sure they can balance the budget.
Yeah, that's a great observation. We're talking to Chris Hand about the latest state, federal, and local political headlines. You can give us a call. We would love to hear from you. You can reach us at 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.com and find all the ways to connect with us. We've got a couple of comments I want to touch on. One from Ricardo. He emailed Fishback. This is the candidate that declared for governor. Fishback is just another Republican troll. Be outlandish and or offensive is the new motto that will get you notoriety. Then he says, just ask a lady proposing Trump County, Anastasia Island, all the way to Daytona. Nonsense, but got national coverage. So, I mean, the idea of a Trump County, I guess nothing is off the table. That is the first I'm actually hearing about that. But that is a proposal that I guess reflects the continuing loyalty that a lot of people in the state have to the president, despite a somewhat fractious party in recent weeks.
Well, and I think why, again, notwithstanding these attacks, Byron Donalds is, I think, if not a prohibitive favorite to win the Republican nomination at this point, a very strong one. The president is still very popular here among Republicans in the state of Florida. His endorsement in the 2018 primary rocketed Ron DeSantis past a heavily favored candidate, Adam Putnam, who was in the state's commissioner of agriculture. So I think that endorsement's likely to have a similar effect for Congressman Donalds in this particular election as well.
When you talk about lawmakers and the governor trying to outdo each other, anything you can do, one of the things that comes to the surface is this issue of property taxes, because currently this legislature is looking at 7 potential ways to change and cut property taxes for people with homestead exemptions in Florida. And so, I mean, first of all, the volume of those options and what that means and whether they make it to the voters is something I would like to ask you about. But chiefly, the issue of property taxes is also going to cost this budget no small thing. And so what is the thinking behind, what is the general rationale behind the push to eliminate or cut back property taxes?
Well, and just real quick before I say that, I do want to mention one person who would have had a lot of interesting commentary and writing about this very complex and impactful property taxes issue is Bill Cotterell, who was the longtime Capitol reporter for the Tallahassee Democrat and Gannett News, was an institution in Tallahassee for decades. I'm one of the lucky people who had the privilege to work with Bill from time to time. when I was involved in kind of government and in politics. Bill very sadly died yesterday at the age of 82. So one huge deficit we will see in the 2026 legislature is the absence of Bill Cotterell, who just cast a huge shadow and had a huge impact. So I did just want to mention that to our listeners who follow the process.
Incredibly incisive columnist and writer.
Incredible. And Bill has sadly passed away. But he would have had a lot to say and write about this complex property tax issue because it's going to be the dominant issue in the 2026 legislature. It is, ironically, one issue where Governor Ron DeSantis and State House Speaker Daniel Perez appear to agree that there should be some action on it. Beyond that top line agreement that they should do that on property taxes, though, a bunch of disagreements start at that point. The governor has, generally called for an abolition of all property taxes in the state of Florida, something that would have a, devastating impact, particularly on local governments and school districts. The Florida Policy Institute has sort of estimated that if the state of Florida abolished property taxes overall, which requires a constitutional amendment, local governments would lose about $50 billion in revenue that goes directly to core services, things like police, fire, parks, public works, that sort of thing. It looks like that proposal to completely abolish property taxes is not where this debate is going. So the governor has now sort of pivoted and said that, well, instead what we should do is abolish property taxes on homestead property, property that people use as their primary homes for which they're getting a homestead exemption. Just to put that in some context, right now we have about a $2 billion budget in the city of Jacksonville, and if you were to abolish property taxes on homestead property, the city would lose $400 million in revenue. So 20%, one-fifth of its budget would disappear. So this is a very controversial issue. The governor has, while he said he wants to abolish property taxes on homestead, has not actually put forward a specific proposal or constitutional amendment on that. The House of Representatives has. They had a very large committee dealing with a variety of these issues, and they actually came out with 7 different legislative items that would presumably go on the ballot as constitutional amendments potentially for the voters to choose between. They all surround that, all approach it in a little bit different way, but all surround the theme of abolishing property taxes on homestead property, but exempting schools. Right now, when you get your property tax bill, there's an amount. If you live here, for example, in Jacksonville, there's an amount that is allocated to the city of Jacksonville. There's also an amount that's allocated to the Duval County Public Schools. The schools portion would be unaffected by the property tax changes under most of these proposals. And also under most of these proposals, local governments would be prohibited from lowering the amount of funding provided to law enforcement just because of these property tax changes. So this is going to be a very controversial issue. As you can imagine, this is receiving a very staunch opposition from city and county governments around the state. Property taxes are a pretty crucial funding source for some of these core priorities we've talked about, and this is going to be the dominant issue in the 2026 legislature. There's some heightened standards here. In order to put an amendment on the ballot, it has to pass both houses, or amendments, I should say, since there are a variety being proposed. Both the Senate and the House have to pass that amendment with 60%, not just a simple majority. And then if they get on the ballot, voters then have to pass an amendment by 60% of the vote as well. And as we know from some recent University of North Florida polling, Professor Michael Bender was on your show talking about this. Right now, voters are not there. The support for abolishing property taxes is in the high 40s, not yet in the 60% range that would be required.
Can you imagine a universe in which many of these 7 make it to the ballot, or do you anticipate that by the time the lawmakers are done with it, that they would have winnowed this down to just one, choice for the voters?
That would be the natural progression of things, that there would probably be just sort of, at the end of the day, one amendment. There's going to have to be a lot of negotiation between the Senate and the House over this particular issue, which amendment ultimately goes to the ballot. Of course, the governor is at some point probably going to propose a specific initiative of his own on that regard. So I would be surprised if after all this back and forth, there isn't some negotiation that ends up putting a single proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot as opposed to 7 of them.
I mean, as you say, the governor hasn't yet proposed his own idea. He has been very critical of the ideas that have been put forth, calling them milquetoast. Um, and, some response to that, including from Perez, has said, well, if he's calling this milquetoast, essentially he must be looking at cutting school taxes, because that's really the only sacred cow that hasn't been touched in terms of spending that would be preserved, even if they cut property taxes. That would be the only wiggle room left in terms of a more substantial property tax cut. Can you imagine this governor taking on property taxes that go to schools?
I think that would be fraught with political risk, and which is why you don't see it in any of the bills that the House has recommended, that they very specifically tried to protect schools and tried to protect law enforcement from the impacts of some of these potential property tax changes. So it would be very surprising if the governor tried to go beyond that. Also, because the alternatives to help fund some of these, initiatives that would have to be cut at the local level are things like raising sales taxes. Some of the analysis that's been done and says to make up for the loss in revenue that would come from abolishing property taxes for just on homestead properties, the state would have to raise its sales tax from 6% to almost 9%. So that's a massive 33% increase in the sales tax.
Do any of these proposals, include a replacement, in terms of what would take the place of this money?
They don't, because remember, a lot of this impact would be felt at the local level. I mean, the replacement funding would have to come in from local and state governments, and local governments from around the state, I should say, are looking at a variety of options that they might have to go to in the event that the property tax is abolished. That could be user fees. That could be trying to increase their local option sales taxes, which require voter approval to try and fund programs. So I think you can take it for a certainty that every city and county government in Florida right now is scrambling, trying to identify potential revenue sources they can lean on in the event these property taxes are abolished. But that's where the funding hammer will really fall. And then it will really be a question of, does the state decide to step up and provide some revenue to local governments? There are a limited number of ways they could do that. One would be increasing Florida's sales tax to generate more state revenue, so that revenue can then be directed to local governments. So, the first half of this effort is, can they agree on something with property taxes? And if so, can it go on the ballot and will voters approve it? But the second part's going to be, if voters do approve it, how does the state help backfill some of those gaps in funding so that core local government services don't go away?
Don't straight up collapse. And we know that some governments say that there is no way to replace that money without a huge increase in some other source of revenue.
Particularly in Florida's many rural counties, for whom, this would be a fiscal emergency for any of the 67 counties. It would be a 5-alarm fiscal emergency for most of the rural counties who are very revenue constrained to begin with.
Yeah, I know that the commissioner in Bartow, a city commissioner there, said that there's no scenario where we remove a large portion of revenue source and keep the same services. They would just have to raise taxes on something else. We've got a call from Tom on the west side. Good morning, Tom. Go ahead.
Good morning to y'all, too. My question is this. Why not just institute simple means testing of the homeowners to make sure that no one's falling into debt just because of property taxes, but yet everyone is going to be paying something in to keep Florida running?
Well, first of all, Chris, can you explain for people who may not know what means testing would be for a property tax assessment? And whether that's something that would actually be a real consideration of this legislature.
I don't think that's likely to happen for a variety of reasons. One, I think it would be sort of difficult to establish. Means testing means kind of making property taxes contingent on income, kind of what your income is. I think that would be challenging to kind of both set up and then administer, also challenging to put that in the state constitution, which is where kind of it would have to go in order to do that. And I think also unlikely that this particular legislature would institute some sort of means testing kind of issue. Again, it just adds further complication to the issue. And again, as I say, there are some potential sort of administrative kind of challenges with that. Where you tend to see, means testing proposals are things that actually are kind of income driven. So over the years, there's been discussion about kind of making, I mean, there's certain federal programs and state programs right now where one is not eligible if they make above a certain amount of income. Medicaid, for example, the state health care program, that is means tested in the sense that only people below a certain income level are eligible for that program. I think means testing is easier to administer with those kinds of benefit programs, much harder with something like property taxes, both from an administrative standpoint and from an implementation standpoint.
We've got a question from Scott on Facebook, I think asking back to the gubernatorial candidate's position, but asking, what about H-1B visas? Do we truly have the workers to fill those jobs if those, go away or become, as our president is proposing, become just much more expensive?
There's going to be a lot of debate about that. I mean, again, the H-1B visa program has been in place for decades in the United States, largely used by companies in situations where they don't feel like they have an adequate supply of workers in this country and sort of will try to recruit those from other parts of the world to help fill some of those jobs. There's now a lot of debate about whether that program might go away. The federal government sort of made some comments about that, taken some steps in the direction of trying to curb the H-1B visa program, although the president's also made some public comments suggesting that he sees the need for it in certain situations. The governor has now come out and said that he doesn't want state universities making any use of the H-1B program and filling some of their jobs with foreign employees. And so that's going to be a big discussion in the governor's race as well, because it's sort of part and parcel of some of the campaign rhetoric we've talked about. Mr. Fishback and some others are trying to turn the H-1B issue and make that an attack on Byron Donalds and maybe others in the field as well. So we're going to hear a lot more about that issue. Even though we think of H-1B as a federal program and an issue, which it is, it's kind of administered and regulated by the federal government, it's obviously going to be an issue in state government for the next year.
Well, I do want to talk about a rare unifying issue in the state right now because they are few and far between. But this is one that is hugely unpopular for a lot of people in the state, offshore drilling. So this is a proposal from the president that would essentially allow drilling in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and federal waters in that area, potentially as soon as 2027. This is a sea change for a state that has really taken a hard line in a universal way against offshore drilling.
Well, and I think probably brings back some very bad memories for all of those Florida counties that were impacted by the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, which obviously did have impacts in particularly some of the panhandle counties here in Florida. As you say, and this has long been an issue that has kind of unified Floridians across party lines, so much so that in 2018, voters passed a constitutional amendment in this state to ban offshore oil drilling in state waters. What the federal government's talking about doing is allowing drilling not in state waters, but in federal waters, kind of outside the state sort of boundaries. In 2020, during his kind of last year of his first term, President Trump had actually sort of extended the federal moratorium on offshore oil drilling in federal waters outside of Florida until 2037. But, again, just last week, the U.S. Interior Department announced that it was going to open up some waters about 100 miles off the coast of Florida to offshore oil drilling. This received a very swift and loud opposition from a variety of Floridians across party lines, including the governor. Governor DeSantis very quickly came out against this and said the president should go back to the policy he instituted in 2020, where there was a moratorium on drilling. Senator Rick Scott, people who are typically very close allies of the president, Senator Rick Scott came out very loudly against having any sort of offshore oil drilling. Jimmy Patronis, who's the former chief financial officer of the state, now member of Congress representing the Panhandle, sort of pointed out that this would, beyond the environmental and economic impacts, which could be severe, as we saw in the case of Deepwater Horizon, that there could be military impacts as well. There obviously are multiple military bases there in the Panhandle region. That's also a missile testing region as well. He pointed out that beyond the environmental and economic impacts, there could be, significant military and national security implications as well. So you really are seeing a united and full court press to try and get the Interior Department to back off the plans that it's announced. Those plans have not gone into effect yet. There is now a public comment process, but you're going to see a lot of public comment coming in from Floridians of both parties opposing this idea.
I did just want to retread a little bit because we mentioned it. We didn't really get into it too much. The question of budget impacts from Alligator Alcatraz, because that is money that, right now is 200 some $million. Could be more depending on what happens to it. Will obviously be more just even to close it. But this is an issue that the governor has said the state will be reimbursed by the federal government, but that could also take a big bite out of the state's budget if they need to keep financing it.
It could, and there's some litigation going on over whether or not the state, had the ability to kind of move forward with this project. And kind of as part of that, some questions about, is this truly considered a federal project, and therefore it can be eligible for federal reimbursement. So that is an amount of money the state has already spent. I think the governor has said and anticipates reimbursement, but until the money's in the bank, you can't really, count that in the state's coffers. And so there is, both on the legal front and on the governmental front, a number of questions now about when and whether that reimbursement will actually come in. And as you're saying, Ann, that's a very significant chunk of money, particularly in times where the state is about to move from a surplus situation apparently into deficit situations.
Yeah, and those are very difficult turns for lawmakers to make. There's nothing very fun about dealing with it.
Never.
And as you well know, working in government, when there's a deficit, it's not a fun time.
It is definitely not.
For anybody. Well, Chris Hand, it is great to see you as always. Thank you so much for doing this today. I hope you have a great holiday this week, and we'll see you in December.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thankful to you and your team for everything you do here at First Coast Connect, Ann.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. We love having you. We'll be back in just a minute. We're going to be talking about the dangers of space junk. We ask our resident spaceman what it is and what it means for space exploration.
The Fort Mose Jazz and Blues Series returns this February with 2 weekends of music featuring Gary Clark Jr., Ladisi, the Robert Cray Band, Don Was, Samara Joy, and more. Tickets and information available at discoverfortmose.com. The Women's Board, benefiting Wolfson Children's Hospital, presents the 2025 First Coast Design Show, December 5th through 7th at the Prime Osborne Convention Center. Opening night gala, lectures by renowned designers, and a children's fashion show. Learn more, firstcoastdesignshow.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Accidents can happen when you least expect it. For decades, our attorneys have dug out the facts to help juries decide who's at fault.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
From Riverside to the Riverwalk, from the beaches to downtown, WJCT News 89.9 is Jacksonville's voice every morning. Trusted, local, and #1 for Morning Drive.
The global internet is actually powered by hundreds of thin cables along the ocean floor, thanks to one man's quest to create the first transatlantic cable over 100 years ago.
If you look at a present-day cable map of the world, and you look at the 1902 cable map of the world, you will see those cables are on exactly the same routes.
I'm Juana Summers, the origins of today's World Wide Web, on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Starting at 4 on WJCT News 89.9.
Small businesses employ more than 40% of the U.S. workforce, but they're facing uncertainty driven by tariffs that push up import costs, high interest rates on loans, immigration policy changing access to labor, and more. Now consumers say they plan to spend less this holiday season than in previous years. We check in on the health of small businesses next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Your headies on? Welcome back. A trio of Chinese astronauts were stranded in space this month after suspected space junk cracked the window on their return capsule. Here to discuss the hazards of space debris is Eddie Whistler, Director of Planetarium and Outreach at the Museum of Science and History, and our resident spaceman.
Space person, I am.
Space person. Sorry.
Spaceman. Yeah, no,
okay,
that's fine.
You were
the
correcting
spaceman
me.
kind of makes it sound like I go to space. I want zero to do with actual visitation.
Yeah, you're out there enough just being here.
Yeah.
I'll be frank.
And not only that, motion sickness and things like that with me.
Little
I'm
Dramamine.
all right. I just let my
Little
brain go
Dramamine,
there.
you'd be fine, man. It'll be okay.
Okay, well then now I'm going.
Okay. Talk to Bezos. Talk to the Blue Origin folk. And anyway, space junk. So this, the good news is these astronauts.
It's so easy for us to get off
I know,
topic. That's what I
It
love.
just goes all awry easily. These astronauts are back. They're safe. But this was a bit of a pickle that they were in.
Yeah.
They're heading out to space and slam into probably a very small piece, relatively speaking, of space junk. First of all, what is the situation with space junk? What is space junk? Where does it come from? How much is there?
So there was an issue with the International Space Station a few years back as well, something very similar. And, people get stranded up there because you depend on spacecraft to get you back that need to be they need to be in working order. And now they get slammed into something which is traveling 3 times, 5 times faster than the average speed of, high velocity bullets. And so you have all this stuff flying around. There's 30,000 pieces of space junk that we're tracking that are over 10 centimeters. That's about the range. Anything over 10 centimeters, we can kind of track it easy, gray area somewhere in there. And then below 1 centimeter, it's
So that's like the size of like a softball kind of?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
And of course you have stuff that's more round. You have stuff that looks possibly more like a pencil, bent metal or something like that. And then there's the stuff that are paint chips. And there's the stuff that are like fragments of something that got broken off during a launch, or, think of all the different maneuvers and the different things that need to happen with spacecraft and satellite in orbit, and little tiny flecks of stuff go out. And so there's potentially 10 or maybe 100 million little pieces of things that are under a centimeter.
So it's sort of like plastics in the ocean. They're out there. Is there any way to gather them back once they're spread about?
So plastics in the ocean, amazing analogy, because when we first were developing this stuff, it's like, we have all the room on Earth in order to, there's no problem with this plastic stuff, but then unintended consequences and the capability to manufacture huge amounts. Oh, now we have a problem with plastics. Well, it's the same with spacecraft. Early on, you can even get these awesome videos of like Buzz Aldrin and other people in space, and especially in the early Gemini days, just like throwing tools and stuff out, on their spacewalks and stuff like that. But now that kind of thing is something that we really need to pay attention for.
Frowned upon.
Yeah. And so, you go from that to now having this issue where, we need to get together as United Nations, to steal a term, in order to everybody be on the same page, because we have this shared space and a potential tragedy of the commons in these different orbits that are good for different reasons that can fill up with spacecraft and unused ones.
So you say we're tracking 30,000 of these items. So we're just watching them move, and then when we're launching, we're trying to make sure there's like a big enough hole in the space that we're not going to get struck by something. I mean, is that kind of the calculation?
So I imagine, I don't know how much of that goes into launch windows, but if it's not there yet, you can imagine a place that gets too filthy, that you do need to consider it. So I don't know the level at which launches, but satellites and materials that are already functioning and in space, we're tracking the dead pieces, and maneuvers need to be made by those spacecraft if they know that they will be too close to some of these other things that are being tracked.
Well,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and I think we just celebrated, I received notice that there was the 100th launch that SpaceX did this year so far. Are those things just kind of going up there? Is there any way to bring them back? Things like satellites, or do those just kind of self-dispose and fall out of the sky, or what happens to them?
There's layers to this. So the lower it is, it could take maybe a decade, and that thing would fall through and burn up in the atmosphere on its own. So the lower that it is in altitude, in orbit, the quicker it will do itself in. But the medium Earth orbit, now we're talking about something that's not going to deorbit for centuries or even thousands of years on its own. And so that stuff is up there for good. And the more the launches, the more the little bits of debris. But we can take steps when building these things to have it in the design that it stays together and doesn't put off. And of course, we don't trash things on purpose.
Right. Pick up your junk, people. Eddie
Pick
Whistler,
up your junk.
it's nice to have you here. Thanks for doing this.
So much fun.
Happy holiday. And that's our program. Thanks for listening. Join us tomorrow when we talk about creative gifting, whether it's to nonprofits, shopping at local businesses, or thrift giving. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The Fort Mose Jazz and Blues Series returns this February with 2 weekends of music featuring Gary Clark Jr., Ladisi, the Robert Cray Band, Don Was, Samara Joy, and more. Tickets and information available at discoverfortmose.com.
This is WJCT News